Enlightenment and Evolution. So as we embark on the study of anthropological theory, it's important to understand that anthropologists aren't the first people to attempt to describe and explain humanity, to attempt to describe and explain differences between different human groups. For example, in ancient Greek thought, differences among humans were explained through either the creation of different races by the gods or via climatic and environmental factors. If you look at ancient Chinese philosophical texts, such as those by Confucius, the Confucian Analects, for example, to emphasize this importance of roles and hierarchy in determining human differences. By the time of the medieval period in Europe, a concept known as the Great Chain of Being existed, which explained human differences by their relationship to God. So God was at the top of a universal hierarchy, and then you had various Christian peoples that were sort of close to God, and as you got further, you would have non-Christian peoples, other animals, plants, and then things like inanimate matter. All of these theories, whether we view them as correct or as false, as true or wrong, they are ways that humans have attempted to explain the differences between human groups. By the time of the European Enlightenment and the development of the beginnings of anthropology, thinking about human differences underwent radical change. I mean, if we think about the historical and political context, if we think about the 17th and 18th centuries, you have the development of absolutism, the development of the feudal system, of monarchs, right, and aristocrats. You had the expansion of that system throughout Europe. Then you had the development of new ideas about constitutions and democracy, and you have the development of revolutions that overturned that former order and put into being a very different kind of historical and political context, the period of what we call modernity. If you think about a philosopher such as Immanuel Kant, so Kant's living 1724 to 1804, he develops this idea of enlightenment, of humans becoming more enlightened than they had been in the past. They were beginning to think with reason, they were beginning to utilize science and the scientific method, and they valued individuals and individual autonomy in thought and decision making. This was a real contrast, let's say, with the previous historical moment where belief in theology, belief in religion, belief in Christianity, faith, and church really were central in people's thinking about knowledge, right, and wisdom about humanity. So Kant, in his Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View, this was published in 1798, and this was one of Kant's last works, he really emphasized understanding human beings sort of independently of traditional ways of thinking. So he emphasized understanding human beings freed from the great chain of being, that idea that was so dominant in medieval Europe. He emphasized, like we think of for enlightenment just generally, he emphasized using observation. He emphasized using reason, using science to understand human beings. And rather than relating them to a theological system such as Christianity, he sort of emphasized this idea of pragmatic point of view to understand humans through their own terms. So not trying to get at somehow a transcendent truth of humans, but by looking, using observation, and thinking about the task that they set themselves to and what they're actually doing in their lives, a kind of new perspective on them, a new perspective on human beings kind of generally, but very much the differences at the population level. And this was very revolutionary, just the same way that there's political revolutions that were happening. There's kind of this revolution in knowledge that's occurring. And anthropology is very much a part of that. Anthropology comes out of that historical moment. So Enlightenment in the term really is grounded in Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment? And Kant said, well, enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without guidance from another. Right? This is very much an attack on faith. It's very much an attack on the clergy and the church, with the priests, right, guiding people's understanding of the world through scripture and revelation and the ideas of God within Christianity. Kant continues, this immaturity is self-imposed when its cause lies not in a lack of understanding, but in the lack of resolve and courage to use it without guidance from another. So this is very much a kind of revolutionary attack. These are very strong words when we think of the period in which they were written, this kind of mid-late 18th century, when this political revolution that we're talking about had just really occurred. And the new role, right, of religion in an increasing secularizing society was challenged. So we can think about scientific revolution and scientific classification as an outgrowth, right, of this time. Increasingly, observation and science is being emphasized to understand not only humans, but the entirety of the world. The world now being the book, if you will, of which knowledge derives. Nature as a kind of book by which knowledge derives. And so you have naturalists like Carl Linnaeus, founders really of science as we think about it today. So Linnaeus, 1707 to 1788, really contributed to this idea of scientific classification, that one could look at the world through reason, could classify biological life, right, according to shared biology, shared morphological, formal kinds of characteristics. And so Enlightenment scientists embraced a very mechanistic view of the natural world, that through observation you could govern its laws, that it was something that was amenable to understanding. It wasn't disordered, it wasn't chaotic. It was something that was governed by very clear laws that could be determined. And this really paved the way for the idea that humans could also, like the rest of the natural world, be studied and understood through scientific inquiry, ultimately laying not, this Kantian foundation of philosophical anthropology, but for modern scientific anthropology. Linnaeus said, right, all things are found on the earth go by the names of elements or natural bodies. Natural bodies can be divided into mineral, vegetable, and animal. Minerals have growth, vegetables have growth and life, animals have growth, life, and feeling. Names of genera, species, and varieties are to be written. And sort of anthropology steps in to write, if you will, the varieties of humanity, the varieties of human being. And this leads to one of the earliest anthropologist here in the United States, Samuel George Morton, lived from 1799 to 1851. So this is right after the War of Independence, the Revolutionary War here in the United States that overturned the British monarchy. And early U.S. anthropology was not an academic discipline at this point of time. There was no way to study anthropology at a university level. It was associated with the Bureau of American Ethnology. This was a research unit of the Smithsonian, and it had the goal as a government office or government bureau to understand the colonization of North America and the encounter of Europeans with Native Americans. So it was focused really on the description and trying to understand Native American cultures and languages. But if we think about the moment in which this was occurring, so colonization, revolution, the development of a new state, You have that kind of intersecting, right, with the rise of science and the use of scientific method in ways that are, we would say, highly problematic today. So Samuel George Morton begins to think about human variation, human differences through the lens of science and through the lens of morphology, through the lens of biological and physical differences. And so for Samuel George Morton, he was very interested in measuring the cranial capacities of different human populations. So he's associated with developing racist theories, theories of race and racial hierarchies. So he would collect large numbers of skulls of native peoples and Europeans and compare them with peoples from other parts of the world. And he was claiming that the differences between human populations were primarily racial and biological. And he established this hierarchy where you have Caucasians at the top, and then Mongolian peoples, and then Malay peoples, then American Indians, with Africans at the very bottom of this hierarchy. And this was a new, progressive, cutting-edge theory of human differences from the late 18th into the 19th century, and of course, even continues in our world today. This is from some observations on the ethnography and archaeology of the American Aborigines. In his words, "We call attention in the first place to two skulls from a mound about 3 miles from the mouth of the Huron River, Ohio. The two skeletons were of a man and a woman. The male cranium presents, in every particular, the characteristics of the American race. The forehead recedes less than usual in these people, but the large size of the jaws, the quadrangular orbits, and the width between the cheekbones are all remarkably developed, while the rounded head, elevated vertex, vertical occiput, and great interparietal diameter renders the skull a type of national conformation. These crania, together with upwards of 400 others of nearly 60 tribes and nations, derived from the repositories of the dead in different localities over the whole length and breadth of both Americas, present a conformable and national type of organization, showing the origin of one to be equally the origin of all. I can aver that 16 years of almost daily comparisons have only confirmed me in the conclusions announced in my Crania Americana that all the American nations, excepting the Eskimo, are of one race, and that this race is peculiar and distinct from all others. Of these propositions may be regarded as an axiom in ethnography. The second still gives rise to a diversity of opinions, of which the most prevalent is that which would merge the American race in the Mongolian." So obviously these ideas were tremendously influential, and a new scientific and biological understanding of humanity was at the heart, really, of the work of Darwin, Charles Darwin, that is so important in understanding the development of anthropology. So Darwin's 1809 to 1882, roughly the same period that we've been talking about. And Darwin introduces the idea of evolution, right? That organisms are evolving over time through a process of natural selection, biological variation within populations, those variations that are providing advantages for survival, for reproduction, get passed on to successive generations. While Darwin didn't develop the notion of social Darwinism, this was a popularization of Darwinian thought at the time, it was suggested, right, that principles of natural selection, where the fittest individuals thrive and the less fit diminish, can be extended to human populations, asserting that certain classes, races, nations were inherently superior and destined to dominate others. And this was very much used, right, for the naturalness of European colonization of North America and the naturalness, right, of the dominance of Europeans over Native American peoples. In Darwin's own words, "The intellectual and moral faculties of man are variable, And we have every reason to believe that the variations tend to be inherited. We can see that in the rudest state of society, the individuals who were the most sagacious, who invented and used the best weapons and traps, and who were best able to defend themselves, would rear the greatest number of offspring. The tribes, which included the largest number of men thus endowed, would increase in number and supplant other tribes. And this is from his On the Descent of Man. So in conclusion, the Enlightenment overturned medieval ideas about human differences. And while we talked about medieval ideas, we talked about some of the ideas about human differences from Europe and China, we could look at the Arab world and the ideas of Ibn Khaldun. So this isn't something unique to humanity, that human populations have been trying to understand a perception of difference between one population and another throughout time. We just see in the period of the Enlightenment, right, new ideas coming into being. So the Enlightenment gave rise, on the one hand, to a kind of philosophical approach that rejects the use of theology in understanding humanity, and the subsequent development of a scientific approach to understanding human differences in new ways. And one of the central theories that developed was really the idea of biological evolution. It's a very powerful theory of human differences, and it's a very problematic theory too.